Hello. So in this video, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Sarah Neville about early modern book practices or textual artifacts from the early modern period of English printing. So first off, Sarah, thank you so much for taking the time to answer some questions for me.
I'm happy to be here.
All right, I'm going to pull up this bio so I get this right. So Sarah Neville is an assistant professor of English at The Ohio State University with a courtesy appointment in theater, film, and media arts. She's an assistant editor of the New Oxford Shakespeare from 2016 to 2017, for which she edited 5 plays in both old and modern spelling editions, as well as an associate coordinating editor of the Digital Renaissance editions. Her essays on book history, Renaissance drama, textual scholarship, and digital editing have appeared in Shakespeare, Shakespeare International Yearbook, Variants, Textual Cultures, Notes and Queries, and Edited Collections. She's the founder and creative director of Lord Denny's Players, an academic theater company that enables students to see how technologies of textual transmission have shaped the reception of Shakespeare's plays. Her forthcoming monograph, Early Modern Herbals and the Book Trade, English Stationers and the Commodification of English Botany, demonstrates the ways that printers and booksellers enabled the construction of scientific and medical authority in early modern England. She's also a fantastic professor.
Thank you.
I had Sarah for a class called Shakespeare's Borrowers, and it was great.
Well, that's good. Maybe I should teach that class again.
Yeah, I think it was a fantastic course. So we're gonna talk today about early modern textual variations. So I want to start with this idea because a lot of people, I think, conceptualize Shakespeare plays as single things, single existing versions, because we tend to, I don't know, encounter one particular text in high school or whatever it is. But that's not really the case in the early modern period, right? There's a lot of different versions of these plays floating around. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like, what's going on in the early modern period in terms of printing?
So one of the things with Shakespeare is that that makes Shakespeare interesting and varied is that we don't have Shakespeare's original manuscripts. They didn't survive. They didn't make it to our century. So when we talk about a Shakespeare play, when we talk about Hamlet or Romeo and Juliet or King Lear, we're talking about a work that comes down to us, that descends to our modern moment through copies of printed books. Yeah. So Shakespeare's plays made it into print. Those printed books survived in many cases, but not all. They had his name on the cover of them. And we know from other documents of the period that these were his works, because people talked about Shakespeare writing these plays. So when we get the closest that we can get to Shakespeare's original manuscript is through this veil of print, which is helpful and marvelous because print made lots of copies of stuff, and that means that there were lots of copies of the first folio that were printed. More of those copies means that at least one of them, and in fact over 200 of them, survived. So we have copies of plays like Macbeth and Twelfth Night that existed only because they were printed in that first folio of 1623. Yeah. So Shakespeare's first folio has 36 plays in it. And that was a large book that was printed after Shakespeare's death in 1616. His friends and fellow actors got together and they manufactured this large book in honor of their friend, and they assembled almost all of his plays together in this volume. But of those 36 plays, 18 of them were printed for the first time in that first folio. That's the earliest printing we have of those plays. But of the other 18, they had been printed during Shakespeare's lifetime in single volumes in various, and some of them were very, very successful. They were reprinted many times, like Richard II and Richard III and the Henry IV plays were printed many times. Some of them, like Much Ado About Nothing, were printed only once. But so for half of Shakespeare's canon, in other words, we have potentially two versions of his plays. We have a version that was printed earlier during his lifetime and a version that was printed in the first folio. And when you compare line by line, detail by detail, those plays, you notice these variants between them. And so scholars then have to figure out the history of how did these plays come to make it to print, and what does that tell us about Shakespeare's dramatic process, or the theater's dramatic process. And that's where textual editors step in to help answer those questions.
Okay. So you had sort of touched on this a little bit with the folio as a large book, but right, the two main types of printings of Shakespeare's works in the early modern period are folios and quartos. So can you tell us about the differences between those, and like how those two different, like what are they and how do those things come to exist?
Sure. So the difference between a quarto and a folio really is a technical term about the way a book is made. So in the printing, in this early period of hand press printed books, right, where books are set by movable type and a hand press, paper is more or less a standardized size. And so books are either made out of pieces of paper folded together. So a folio book is made out of pieces of paper that have been folded once to make little booklets of 2 leaves or 4 pages. And it's a fairly large book when you take a standard sheet of paper and you fold the paper once. A quarto is folded an additional time. So it's half the size, and it makes a book that's made out of little booklets of paper that have been folded twice. So 4 leaves, 8 pages. And then you can make books by getting smaller, folding again and folding in slightly different varieties. But in short, quartos are smaller books, both literally and often in terms of length as well, because a play quarto would be sold on its own. And a book purchaser in the period would regularly bind it with other books. Shakespeare's first folio, having 36 plays in it, wouldn't have been bound with other books because it itself was quite a massive and substantive volume, in the same way that like an anthology of plays for a class textbook is going to be larger than if you bought those books individually.
Yeah. So so you told us that the first folio was created by Shakespeare's friends, fellow actors, etc., etc. How did the quartos come to exist? Like, was that Shakespeare saying, I want to publish this play? Or do we think that's not what happened?
In general, we don't think that Shakespeare was particularly personally invested in the publication of his plays, but we don't know for sure. Okay. We do know that he was invested in the publication of his long poems, which were exceptionally popular in print. That's Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, which he came out in 1593, 94, thereabouts, and then just kept getting reprinted after that. Shakespeare was really a hot seller for those sexy long poems of his. But his plays make it to print. They start making it to print around 1594. And one of the things that we see, if you look at his plays, Shakespeare's name doesn't appear on his playbooks at first. It's only a little while later, I think it's 1598, that we start 1597 or 1598, that his name starts to appear, and it starts to appear in small type, and then it gets bigger. So that by into the King James's reign, Shakespeare's name could be an advertisement on the cover of a playbook, on the title page of a playbook. Yeah. But prior to that, in that place of an author, you see information about the playing company being the thing that helps to sell the book. This is the Lord Chamberlain's men who performed this play. And it's this kind of evidence that let scholars think maybe the playing company sold the play to the publisher so that they could get some cash for one reason or another. Okay. One reason may have been that the playhouses had closed for plague, so maybe they needed some fast cash. Maybe because the timing, of course, is really difficult to manage, down to a month or even sometimes a year in these archives. Maybe actually it was the reverse. So when the playing houses reopened, they sold some plays to get these books for sale in the way that you have like movie tie-ins with adaptations. Yeah. Like, we're coming back, so get your copy of Henry IV. That might be the other thing we could be seeing.
Okay. So one story that I've been told in classes, and this may or may not be true, was that there were these sort of theater pirates who would go in to shows, and like their job was to memorize a character's lines in real time and then like come out and, I don't know, write them all down or repeat them back to someone, and then people like pirated Quarto editions that they had paid people to memorize. Like, is that just a fun story, or is there evidence for that?
Well, it's funny that you ask this, because my theater company, Lauren Denny's Players, just made a documentary film specifically about this, called Looking for Hamlet 1603, which is available on YouTube. When
and I will
we
put a
could
link
not...
to that down in the description so
Awesome.
that people watching this video can see it.
We were going to put on a production of the first Quarto text of Hamlet, which came out in 1603, but because of COVID, we couldn't do that. So we had to think about how to make something else. And we decided to make a movie about this very weird text of Hamlet that created a stir when it was rediscovered, because it was lost for a long period of time. And then it was discovered in the 19th century, after Shakespeare's Hamlet had become like the quintessential piece of Shakespeare's oeuvre. And that meant that when people encountered this other version of Hamlet that had been published earlier, they thought it was weird and wrong and broken, and they had to come up with reasons for its weirdness and its wrongness and its brokenness. And so we started to get a ton of theories about that. And one of the theories was exactly what you said, that somebody or several somebodies came into the theater, they saw the good version of Hamlet, and then they were surreptitiously writing down in shorthand what it was they were seeing so that they could rush it to a publisher and sell it. And this idea kind of keeps coming back like a bad penny, even as it gets rebutted by scholars. And so and another version of it is that the actors playing like Marcellus and sometimes other figures in the play were memorizing lines and garbling them as they tried to write down the whole play from memory. But it's a version of something called memorial reconstruction. And it's a popular theory because it means that Shakespeare's Hamlet was always perfect and wonderful, and we never have to explain what this other earlier Quarto was doing, because we can just say that it was bad, that it came even though it was published first, it came after. And so there are some scholars who are trying to recuperate this argument now, though I'm not sure it's a particularly satisfying proof of that this sort of thing happened for Hamlet. People did write shorthand. They did take shorthand of things like sermons.
Yeah.
When they would go to church. But shorthand wasn't standardized, and there was only a handful of early modern folks who knew how to do something like that at the time. So like the practicalities have not been really fully ironed out in terms of this as a theory. But what I think is really interesting is that when the theory first emerged, these romantic critics who came up with it, the guy who came up with it was himself a master of shorthand.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of a to a man with a hammer, every problem looks like a nail kind of scenario, where he saw shorthand in everything, and then he just kept we just kept finding bad quartos after that. That's what these plays are that seem to have hints of shorthand in them were known. We went from like to explain this one play, then he started to see it everywhere. Yeah. And dozens of plays were now seen as evidence of this practice, that there is no contemporary evidence for the practice actually happening in the playhouse.
Okay. So one of the things you've been sort of talking about is this idea of bad quartos versus the folio and things like this. So, like, what kinds of differences are we talking about here? Like, are these just sort of like minor word choice issues, or like the spelling of the idiosyncratic spelling of the early modern period, or are we talking like whole speeches are completely different or something like this?
The short answer is yes, all of that. So for some, it depends on the play. For a play like Shakespeare's Love's Labour's Lost, that was printed in Quarto and then it was printed in the Folio again, the differences are relatively minor. Okay. They're there, but they're not huge. Same thing for Much Ado About Nothing. You can go through and you'll definitely see variations in spelling and punctuation, but you're not, and maybe a line might be in one version that's not in the other because something got dropped or flipped. You'll see a couple of those things. That's just true because of every time you copy something, you're going to introduce errors. But there are other plays, and a good number of them, I would say half a dozen, depending on how you count, maybe as many as 10, where Shakespeare's, the variations are so substantive that you need a larger theory. And the variations are things like the plot might stay the same, and the gist of each speech, this is something like The Merry Wives of Windsor, the gist of each speech seems the same. Falstaff is saying something about being dunked, and he's really upset about it. The gist is the same, but the language is just totally different. Okay. And then you can see a kind of change. The difference between, the way the female characters, the amount of talking that female characters get in Romeo and Juliet, Q1, is different than in the second quarto of Romeo and Juliet, or even the Folio version. So Romeo and Juliet is interesting because there's 3 variant versions. Yeah. Because there was the first quarto and then another quarto after that, and it was different. So very early on, we get that difference. And then there's another version to kind of reconcile. With something like King Lear, the difference can be in whether or not King Lear believes at the end of that tragedy, whether Lear dies believing that Cordelia is still alive.
And that's a major change.
The major change. Does he die? Does his heart burst in hope, or does it burst in despair because he knows she's dead?
Yeah.
So these things are major changes. In the case of Hamlet, which is another play that has 3 texts, a first quarto, a second quarto, and a folio, we get differences in character as well. The character of Polonius Ophelia and Laertes' father is named Corambus in Q1. He has a different name.
Okay.
So that's another, and so does his servant. So Rinaldo is I'm forgetting the other name. I'm forgetting his. I should remember this, but I've forgotten it. But his servant has a different name as well.
Okay.
And so clearly, and this can't be the result of a mishearing, because Polonius and Corambus don't sound anything alike.
No.
So something else must be going on there. And so one of the theories that I think is the most compelling one, because, and we have evidence of this from other mechanisms as well, is that Shakespeare revised his plays.
Yeah.
After they had been just like a regular playwright would. Even now, playwrights change their minds when they see things on the stage.
Yeah.
And they want to they want to have a different emphasis, or they get better at what they're doing and they shift. And in Shakespeare's case, one of the reasons why he often seems to have changed his mind or wanted to revise his plays involved his relationship to the court of Queen Elizabeth and then the court of King James.
Yeah.
And that when his company would be assigned to perform at court, certain elements it provided an occasion for a wholesale revision of a play should he choose to do it. And he often seemed to. He couldn't keep his hands off his work. And that's how we got versions that tended to get longer, often more dramaturgically interesting in the sense of a kind of complexity, but often more streamlined. So like they just, it's like watching, I don't know, a director's cut of a film. Often they're more, they get bloated.
Yeah.
There's a more is more effort. Whereas sometimes the earlier plays, or as I've been exploring in the past couple of years with early productions of these early quartos, what you see is there's really a kind of energy and a spontaneity in the dramatist's mode of, let's bring people on let's have a recurring joke, and audiences are quite responsive to that. I think Shakespeare's doing a lot of that earlier in his plays or earlier in his drafts. And then he sophisticates it out to become more literary or to become a little bit more character oriented as he goes through his career, which is good for reading, good for English professors. The theater professor in me finds that a little bit more boring. So it's a nice tension that it helps to explain why Shakespeare is in the English department rather than quite so prevalent in the theater department.
Yeah. So with all of those differences between various editions, like that raises a lot of problems for editors today, right? So as a Shakespeare editor, and I'm sure everybody has their own process for this, but as a Shakespeare editor, how do you decide what goes into a particular modern published edition? Like how do you decide that Polonius's name should be Polonius rather than Corambus? Or maybe not even as dramatic as that, but how do you sort of navigate these early published texts?
Well, this is a really good question, and it's a one that has a massive theoretical history associated with it, right? Because if you are an editor, you first have to decide like what thing it is you are editing. And on the one hand, to say I'm going to edit Hamlet seems straightforward until you realize there are 3 texts of Hamlet.
Yeah.
So are you editing a document that was printed in 1603 because that's the first quarto, or one that was first printed in 1604 because that's the second Quarto, or the Folio Hamlet, which is 1603. So the one editing series, the Arden 3, decided that they were just going to edit all three texts separately, and they don't have to really, as if they are totally separate things. And they're going to sidestep the question of the fact that all three of these things came from the same human brain.
Yeah.
And that's a legitimate attitude to take. I don't think it's always quite so satisfying at a theoretical level, but it certainly makes a logical sense that these things survived. So that's what we're going to edit, and we're going to treat them more or less like the documents that they are. Scholarly textual editors will usually go a further step back and say, okay, well, what was Shakespeare doing when he was thinking about Hamlet, and at a particular moment in time?
Yeah.
And so you have to make a decision as an editor. Do you want the Shakespeare's original idea about Hamlet that he first saw acted on the stage, whenever that was, and then you have to sort of do all of the historical work to figure out when that was? Or do you want the thing when he was on his deathbed and could not change Hamlet?
Yeah.
What Hamlet, and he had all of the options that had been available, what he wanted Hamlet to be. And neither of those, or some point in between, right? Middle-aged Hamlet, pretty happy with himself, at the top of his game. You have to fix your author's intention at a particular moment, and explain that intention in order to go that theoretical step beyond. And so that's kind of the first thing that an editor has to do, is make that decision for whatever reason. And they can make it on whatever basis they want. They just have to explain it, and they have to tell their readers of their edition what it is they are doing. And that's kind of the lovely thing about editing, is you can kind of do anything you want. You just have to rationalize why you're doing it. And then once you do that, all of the decisions that you make have to come back to support that decision. Yeah. That first decision.
Yeah.
But the decision,
a unified impression.
Yeah. But the decision comes not from the document that you're using. It comes from your decision to respect a particular moment of an author's creation of a thing. And it doesn't necessarily, even if you don't know who that author is, even if the text is anonymous, even if you're working with like a medieval play, it exists because somebody wrote it, right? And so you have to figure out that intentionality that you're working within. If you're working with a publisher who wants to publish something, you're working with someone's intentionality. And so what you're trying to get at is a thought, a desire from the past. You have to do some work to kind of set up an understanding of, but that clarity is the thing that you can then pin the rest of your decision making on, and it makes being an editor a lot easier, because the historical record doesn't help us when we're basing our evidence on just something that happened to survive for 450 years. That's great, but if it didn't, all kinds of accidents happen to documents. So it's not a particularly stable approach.
Okay. So the last question I wanted to ask you is sort of looking at things from the other direction. Like, what should readers know about these sort of early modern textual options in these variants? Like, if I'm reading Hamlet or King Lear or whatever it is, like, what should I as a reader keep in mind about this? What are the stakes for this, I guess?
Well, every edition that you read is going to have something called a textual note somewhere. It's going to usually be in the beginning or the end of the book, called a textual note or a textual introduction that will tell you what the editor did to Shakespeare's words, or what that rationale, who they thought they were writing, what intention of Shakespeare's were they working for? Were they working for something Shakespeare by himself in his like windowed garret, or is it Shakespeare watching his players perform and taking those suggestions? Because those are going to make some changes. So that textual note is going to tell you that, and it will give you some information. Within the body of the edition, depending on what kind of edition you have, you might see other notes that that give you some collation information, or a collation is just a comparison of how that speech, that word, might have appeared in other variations. And sometimes the paratextual notes will help you understand that as well. If you're curious, because that textual note will say, there's 3 versions of this play. And this text starts with this version. Or it will say it's a completely sort of ground up. There's only one version, like Julius Caesar has one text that you can use as its basis. It wasn't printed in Quarto, it was only printed in the Folio. So an editor doesn't really have to choose what text they start with when they edit that play. But you still have to decide whether it's the Julius Caesar that comes hot off Shakespeare's pen, or the Julius Caesar that the actors are performing. So the notes help you understand that minutia of individual decision making that an editor made as they constructed the text, and that can be revealing. The other thing that is often the case with Shakespeare is that stage directions are pretty light in the actual texts, but editors have taken upon themselves a rather free hand to pepper them in, to say things like, they kiss. Do they though? Do they really? So almost
it's
always
sexier if they do.
It's sexier if they do. She kneels. Does she though? And that's helpful when you're reading a play and you don't have that kind of dramaturgical literacy to know physical actions are kind of helping you to understand these speeches. But often editions by an editor will be in square brackets, which signifies their editorness, that an editor has inserted their best guess as to how this thing should be directed. And it's useful to keep in mind that while those things are informed guesses, they are often just informed guesses. And especially as you move backwards through the 20th century, you can find that they have a particular gendered bent to them, because editorships were often male. And so ideas about what is appropriate for women often circulate in those stage directions. Similar issues with race and class appear, and sort of heteronormativity appear within those things too. So often the reason for editing happening over and over again, why Shakespeare and other writers need to be continuously re-edited, is that editors are the products of their own historical moments, and they impose their own glosses upon the historical artifacts of Shakespeare's words. So take those details with a grain of salt.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been fantastically informative. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview with me.
You're very welcome. It was nice to chat.